and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink, and this is the second episode in our series After the Bomb, Sci-Fi Movies of the 1950s. Today, we'll be talking about Them, a 1954 black and white science fiction monster film produced by Warner Bros. And starring James Whitmore, Edmund Gwenn, Joan Weldon, and James Arness. It follows the story of police officers and scientists as they discover and fight giant, nuclear, man-eating ants in the New Mexico desert and Los Angeles.
By direction of the President of the United States, stay in your homes. I repeat, stay in your homes. Your personal safety, the safety of the entire city, depends upon your full cooperation with the military authorities.
Yes, cities, nations, even civilization itself, threatened with annihilation. Because in one moment of history-making violence, nature, mad, rampant, wrought its most awesome creation. For born in that swirling inferno of radioactive dust were things so horrible, so terrifying, so hideous. There is no word to describe them.
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true. And there shall be destruction and darkness come up in creation. And the beast shall reign over the earth.
Yeah, this is a pretty entertaining one, Jeremy. What'd you think? Just first impressions of Them from 1954. Same year as Godzilla.
Yes, same year as Godzilla. It's similar thematically, but, takes things on. This is a classic kind of Americana fare, the classic image of the desert. But
Much more American, yeah.
This is one I really enjoy. This is actually not the first time I've seen this one. I had the fortune, and one of the reasons why I think we were both adamant about including this particular film in this series is that it's so directly tied to the idea of nuclear war and the fallout of nuclear war and then the unexpected consequences. And I actually had the fortune in a college history class. I took this really interesting class with a very tall professor and a very gruff Richard Nixon voice who on the first day we showed up surprised us all by telling us that the first half, it was about a 2-hour class, that the first half of each class would be devoted to traditional lecture style learning, but the second half would be devoted to watching movies that paired with the subject matter that we were talking about. So it's very cool, very progressive class. And when we were learning about nuclear war and the Cold War age in the 1950s, the movie we watched was Them. And I loved it when I saw it in the class, and I loved it now. It's just such a kind of fun, wacky, wild watch, even today.
Yeah. I also have a very specific and very similar memory of this movie, actually, Jeremy. When I was in 4th grade, actually, it was a very rainy day, and instead of going outside to play or watching something somewhat educational, we watched this. And so my teacher was like, hey, let's watch Them. Like, this is a great chance. Just like, I don't know, it's, he was like a really fun, friendly, like, he's like one of the best teachers I ever had. And he was, just into kind of kooky stuff. And so he showed us this movie one day, and it likely did something to me, to my brain, subconsciously, for better or worse. But I really enjoyed it. It always stuck with me. So when we started doing the series, I just immediately thought of this movie. It was actually the first one I thought of. And so I just want to say, I doubt you're listening, but thank you, Mr. McDade.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Professor McGuire.
There you go. The very tall Mr. McGuire.
The very tall.
Professor McGuire. So we both have specific memories of this movie from earlier in our lives, and it is one that just sticks with you. I think it's because it's just so well done. It's just, it's obviously kind of over the top premise, but I think at the time in Hollywood they were kind of reaching for different ideas, and sci-fi was starting to get kind of big around this time, and also just this series obviously is called After the Bomb, and this was on everyone's mind because it wasn't too long after we had talked about Hiroshima and Nagasaki last time, and obviously Godzilla. And, so this is like America's take on the same type of subject involving atomic bombs, atomic testing in New Mexico in the desert. And I guess because of that, this is what causes these giant ants to mutate from the radiation, and they start to threaten civilization, attack people, eat people, mostly off camera, but
Occasionally on camera though.
yeah, they do show more. And
I
I
don't,
do
I don't know if we
remember,
see I don't know if
yeah,
we see them being
being a
swallowed,
kid,
but we
yeah.
see them being kind of attacked and
And I think
gnawed.
that's part of why I remember this movie, like being in fourth grade and like, wow, like
Uh,
my teacher's actually showing me this. Like at the time, it felt almost risque, even though it was a movie from the 1950s.
yeah.
And you still kind of get that, like when I watched it more recently for this. How do you feel about how the actual monsters were handled in this movie?
I think they were handled well. I think, and it's this way for a lot of these movies for me. I mean, I'm personally a pretty big fan of this kind of 50s. Not that this is necessarily B sci-fi. This is a Warner Brothers movie. So I don't know if calling it B sci. I mean, I guess it's kind of.
It feels like a B movie.
It feels like a B movie because it's so outlandish. But
They
for
were
me,
taking a chance. I feel like when
yeah, exactly.
big
And
studios, yeah.
and for me, a lot of these movies, I kind of love the first 15 minutes of them or first 20 minutes the most when they're kind of just setting up the story and we're getting this
Figuring
sense
out
of
what's
town.
going on.
For me, talking, as we talked about Godzilla last week, I think that the monsters and them worked best. Almost kind of the most disturbing moment for me, the most frightening moment was when one of them was when they were walking through these not the tunnels near the end in Los Angeles, but when they were kind of exploring the nest of the ants after they had already killed a bunch of them, which we're hoping that's not really a spoiler alert. That happens relatively early on in the movie, but we're hoping that you're watching these movies along with us because this is a discussion podcast.
Right.
But after they had already killed a bunch of them in this nest using cyanide and explosives, which is just a fun way to take out an enemy, by the way. But one of the most kind of frightening moments for me was when the giant ants were dead on the ground, and you just kind of saw these big, like, hulking shadows. And it almost made me wish, I'm not trying to critique this movie by any means. I think for the time it was really groundbreaking, and I think that they did a nice job overall making these monsters look scary, but I think that I kind of almost wish they kept them in the shadows and gave us a little bit more of an implication of them before kind of showing them. But there is something to be said. I think like the first moment you hear them is really astounding. I love that.
Sound,
yeah, the sound is horrifying. Even
the
now,
insect noises.
yeah, those sounds they freak me out.
Whatever you would call that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess they're communicating with each other. Or...
Yeah, like if you saw that in a Blumhouse movie today, it would still be a scary sound, or if
Yeah.
you heard it rather.
Right.
And that first moment when you see the ant is obviously just
Yeah.
it's wild
Because it is a while until you actually see one.
Yeah, I think you don't see one until about the half-hour mark. And once again, all of this and any kind of I don't even want to use the word critiques. Any kind of discussion we have of the functionality and the how scary these monsters are in this movies is all with the perspective of two things. One being that this was 60 years ago almost, or more. What year? Yeah, I'm forgetting what year we're in for a second. But yeah, these movies were a long time ago, and also that we know what these movies are going into them. It's one of those things where if you just see the poster for a film like this and you maybe see this kind of face of an ant with its claws, you might understand what it is, but you can't even really totally tell that. I'm looking at the poster right now. You can't even totally tell that monster is an ant. It almost looks like it could be an alien.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why, like, I think it would have been really, really frightening at the time because it isn't as absurd as an alien. Obviously now we understand that nuclear radiation isn't turning ants into giant man-eating monsters, but
right. At the time,
it wasn't that absurd.
Right. Yeah, and the fact that the monsters in this movie are ants, it's kind of genius. And it's sort of taken for granted now because there are so many, they call them like the big bug movies, that started around this time after this movie, and became sort of a mainstay in Hollywood after the success of this movie. But at the time, taking an ant, which is everyday household, I mean, everyone at some point in their life has dealt with ants, so it's just it's interesting taking that something incredibly ordinary and turning into horror, which is what they did so well in this movie. Like you said, first with that sound that you hear, which is like, I can't even describe it. It's just, but the second you hear it, it's like iconic to this movie. And I love how you hear it way before you actually see the monster or anything like that, because the sound does come back, and when it comes back, something bad's going to happen. Much like in Jaws with the score. Every time you heard that, da-na, da-na, you knew something was going to happen. So those ideas playing with each other, and they really handle the concept with a severity, because involving, I guess, because it is the atomic bomb, and like you said, Jeremy, everyone at that time, I'm sure they were like very unsure still of what this new power could do, what radiation could do, and we're still learning things about radiation and all of that. So it wasn't, so I think it was just far-fetched enough, but it was still somewhat plausible in some people's minds, maybe. So yeah, it's really like just taking that common household insect and making it into a monster. I thought is kind of genius for the time.
Yeah, it does ground it in a certain amount of reality. The other thing for me that really worked with this movie that I didn't really think about, I think it's one of those things where the classic images of this movie are, obviously the ants and the desert. But one thing I really enjoyed that kind of made it more real for me, there was one scene, I'd like to say about halfway into the movie, when the professor character, or not the professor, the scientist character rather, is showing video of ants and explaining their habitats and their habits. And I love that scene because I mean I don't know the science of ants, that could have all been made up, but the fact that it was paired with this real stock footage and what he was saying at least made sense. None of it, it's because you get these exposition scenes in so many movies, in so many sci-fi movies specifically, and it's always kind of such an eye roll because that it was just some writer sitting at his or her typewriter just making a bunch of stuff up. But with this one, like the science of it, at the very least, felt believable.
Research,
right, yeah. And the fact that we were actually seeing the clips too.
Yeah, you learn a lot about ants in this movie. That's the thing. Like, as I was watching it, that's actually like a note I made. I was like, wow, I'm actually learning things. Like, whether or not I, like you said, it may have been completely made up. I didn't actually like fact check any of.
But kudos if it was.
They were saying, but
it felt real.
Either way. Because the main scientist, the older scientist, who's like the father of the main female character in the movie, he even gives a lecture at one point, which I don't know if that was the same scene you're talking about.
That's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
Yeah. So he like does like a not a PowerPoint, but he has like a projector out and he's like pointing to the screen and everything, and like it's just kind of like interesting that they have this moment where they're just giving you like this lecture about ants. But you kind of need it to understand what they're up against in a way, like things that and it's interesting because it's like things that, because I find insects fascinating, and like what goes on in the insect world that we just human beings just don't think about it because we're going about our own lives, and they're just like tiny little things crawling around. But when the tiny things become huge things and start to attack you, like these things become very important and you have to pay attention to it and learn about them. And I just it's kind of like the ignorance of what because you don't need to know all about these things, but like when you do need to know about them, it's like, wow, you actually like start to appreciate like different different species, different forms of life. And so it's interesting. It's like just watching all these like military professionals and policemen around like learning about ants. It's just kind of like it's just, I don't know, thought it was kind of cool.
Well, and when you do need to know about them, exactly, when you do need to learn about them, you need to learn about them fast, because if you don't, all of a sudden your chances of survival go down really quick. Like I don't know. That's why
you can't take anything for granted.
Exactly.
That's what it's.
Yeah, and that's why those exposition scenes are normally just drive me insane. I normally can't stand a scene like that. But in this one, it felt so like honest
Yeah, it felt imperative to what was going on. Like,
Yeah.
it felt like we needed that scene, and there's like, there's a bunch of scenes like that where the scientists are just explaining to these gruff, like, military men and policemen, like,
Yeah.
wow, well, we're just going to go in there and kill it. And the scientists like, no, wait, you can't do that because, it's a nest and there's a queen and all these different things. And that's what makes the movie, like, I don't know, to me, just so interesting and entertaining. And it just keeps your attention the whole way through. I did want to dive into the movie itself, like what's going on, the plot wise and everything a little bit. So just to start at the beginning. So as you mentioned, Jeremy, we start in the New Mexico desert, and that's where we have our first scene. And that first scene the film gets off to a slow, I would say, but intriguing start. So there is a child, a little girl, and she's walking alone in the desert, and she's looking very traumatized and I would say almost catatonic at one point. But
Absolutely.
she's wandering through the desert, and then she's found by, I forget, I think it's a policeman, right? They pull up and find her, and they start to find the tracks. They start to notice that something's in the area that they've never seen before, insect tracks, but much larger, obviously. And then they hear those noises, and that's the sound that we were talking about, that would return later in the film once things ramp up a little bit. But how did you feel about how the viewers were brought into the film? Do you think it was do you think the beginning made sense, and how they kind of gradually built up to revealing the spiders made sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, the ants.
The ants. You're thinking of another big bug feature.
I was looking at Tarantula because I had it on my IMDb in front of me.
which is a film. Just a quick aside. There's a film called Tarantula that was made in the same era that is another one of these big bug features that I personally would highly recommend. Great.
Yeah, I haven't
sci-fi
seen
film.
it. I really want to watch it now that you've told me about it.
Really interesting. But to get back to it, I thought the beginning of this film worked really well. Also, talking about horror tropes, kind of the possessed or disturbed kid, trope. It's like I mean, I guess you would have seen that kind of thing in movies at this time, but not as much. I don't know if you could even call it a trope yet necessarily at this point in the 50s. So, that was an interesting start because anytime you see something, you see a child with something that's happened to him or her, it's always a little frightening.
Yeah. It's a unique start to a movie, just having a child wandering through a desert by themselves.
Yeah.
You just naturally wonder, like, what the hell happened?
Yeah, very intriguing.
Why is there a kid just walking around? Yeah. So it's kind of cool way to start the movie. And from there, I actually thought there was a lot of good ambiance as well, because there's pretty soon after that, there's a scene where you just hear like the sounds of the howling wind outside, and there's like swinging lights inside the shack that they're in. And eventually it reveals a dead body on the floor. They also find sugar with some ants crawling over it. And that's kind of our first glimpse of ants in the movie.
Which is such great foreshadowing.
I like that you see them.
Know.
Right. I like that you see them as actual, like, normal size ants at first too. So it's all a bit, like we said, like it's all a bit ridiculous, but for a film about giant radioactive ants, like I feel like it's not a bad way to bring you into it. I thought it was actually really well done. The first death is off screen. A lot of the action's off screen, actually. We don't even see, too many ants. I think I was reading you only see up to 3 at a time on screen, for budgetary reasons, I'm sure. But so yeah, atomic bomb testing. Just to go into that for a bit, that was done in. I guess it started around 1945, and that's, so we talked about Godzilla, and I think just like, starting in New Mexico desert just makes a lot of sense for this. It's just like, where else would you start, and I liked how it was, rest of civilization was kind of gradually brought into it from there, and then you have this new team investigating, and then we start to hear that sound again, and we eventually see that first giant ant emerge, which you mentioned, Jeremy, was like a very like kind of like iconic scene where the first ant is actually on screen. You actually see it. And first the main characters try their pistols, and I like that they eventually they blow it away with like a machine gun. It's just like it's like so violent for the time.
Also, I don't know, and that's kind of a classic. I mean, and the thing with a lot of these movies is there are things in them that are going to be a little silly. Inevitably, it's just
that's part of the fun.
Yeah, it's part of the fun of the genre.
That's why they're cult movies.
Yeah, but that's one of those things where it's like, well, if they had the machine gun this whole time, why are they trying to take this
Oh, yeah.
but hey,
I actually laughed at that part when he just like
Maybe
whips out this machine gun.
protocol was different. I don't know.
Yeah. So that's the sound that we've been hearing. Like I said, I think it's the ants communicating with each other, and I think the scientist does go into that a little bit. So they're on a whole different wavelength than humans, which makes it even creepier. Like they're just speaking to each other and giving each other orders, and listening to their queen and things like that, and we just have no idea what they're doing. And there's like that really dramatic moment where the older scientist speaks of a prophecy, like the beast shall reign over the earth. I love that kind of stuff. So that's really good. So yeah, you can tell there was like grander, ideas at play here than just giant ants, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
And the film, eventually gets to the point where we go into the lecture on ants and we learn something about them, and they start to look for the nests. There's a little bit of a love story, because every movie at this time had to have some sort of romantic subplot, sort of, not really.
But what was cool with this particular one, even though when the young woman who's a scientist in the film gets off of, she's getting off of a helicopter.
Joan Weldon is her actress's name.
The actress, yeah. When Joan Weldon is getting off the helicopter, there is that moment where the guys kind of like gawk a little bit, but it was exciting for that time, seeing a woman scientist who was like, digging her foot in when they were telling her a woman can't go down in the hole, and she was like digging her foot in and saying, no, like I know more about this stuff than you do. Which I'm not gonna necessarily point to a lot of movies from this era as being progressive, but within the cultural landscape that it was coming out in, that she was a pretty progressive character.
Right, because at first I was like, oh, here comes the,
the love interest, the ingenue.
Here comes like the sex, because the guy's like, oh, no dame's going down that hole, as long as I'm here. But then eventually she's like, I'm a doctor, like I have to be there.
Yeah.
And, it's so there's still like a little bit of like the old sexism in there, but I think it's handled, and it's almost like they were trying to progress things a little bit, like trying to make people think outside the box a tiny bit. So that was a good thing. So there's a little bit of a love story, I guess, with the main characters, but mostly it's just about the ants and them trying to track and kill the ants, which is their main objective. And the film leads up to the culmination where they're kind of subterranean. They're in the LA sewer system, crawling through pipes and things like that. And those are actually the parts I remembered most from when I first saw the film when I was a kid, just being underground and looking for the ants and being kind of horrifying. And those scenes still hold up. I think they're pretty well done. And so, they have the storm drain tunnels that they're going through. And that's where the big climactic scenes are. And that's where they essentially find the last remaining queens, I believe, right? And they in the nest.
Well, the princesses. It was the next round of the queen ants.
The next round, okay.
Yeah. And then by killing them, it guaranteed that, because as long as I guess the way I understood it was that there might have still been some of the regular ants, moving around. Yeah. But as long as they prevented the future reproduction by taking care of the future queen ants, then there wouldn't be any more, and the problem would be solved
by using a flamethrower, lighting them on fire.
Which is just it's crazy. That whole scene, that whole sequence down in the tunnels is so severe. Like it is great. Crazy warfare.
Yeah, really is. And it's it's interesting because it's much like Godzilla, which is the film we just talked about before this. This movie's played pretty straight, for what's going on. Like it's dealt with a sense of gravitas to it that's actually kind of refreshing, and maybe it's because it's the first one of these movies and they just that's how they wanted to handle it. But it's dealt with such a matter of fact way, and such a kind of like by the book way, but it's thrilling. It's like really just a tightly paced film, and still holds up, I think. And you get to learn a lot about ants, like I said, which is always good.
Well, and there was a lot of with that. There was a lot of realism, I felt too, within the world. Like it's not necessarily that it's real how it would be handled in real life, but to that world, it didn't feel like there were any stretches. It felt like it kind of grew at a reasonable pace. It didn't feel like there was one ant and then all of a sudden there were a million ants, or it didn't feel like there should have been a million ants and there were only one or two, and it didn't feel like
dealt with as realistically as it could be.
Yeah, there wasn't all of a sudden an overreaction where they called in the military. it's like these people tried to deal with it themselves, but then realized it was a bigger problem. Then martial law was declared, and it is kind of just this slow build where it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it really does. Because of that slow build, you realize that these ants are going to multiply exponentially, and if they don't, like there's consequences, which is great, because there are a lot of movies where it's kind of like, if the monster wins, so what? Eventually, people will be able to hide or something. But with this, it's like, no, like these things, we know how fast they multiply. We know how strong they are. We know how adaptable they are. Like if this problem isn't dealt with in Los Angeles, like these things are going to take over the planet.
Yeah, if you kill one, there's going to be like 5 more to take.
5 more, yeah, and we saw how hard it was to just take care of one, and it also raised the question. It's like I believe at one point someone said, well, what kind of we would need like all kinds of bombs and craziness. And it kind of starts to bring up the question, at least in my mind. It's like the thing that caused these ants in the first place to mutate was the atomic bomb test. And you start to wonder what kind of weaponry would have to be developed to fight them. And ultimately, like, is this human penchant for violence just going to keep, in the same way the ants keep multiplying exponentially, is the human ability to keep creating weapons that cause mass destruction, but ultimately are going to cause more problems in the future? Is that also an exponentially growing thing, which is a pretty horrifying idea?
Yeah, well, it's like in Godzilla when they had to use the hydrogen bomb, or I'm sorry, what was it called again?
It was some kind of oxygen depleting.
Oxygen, yeah.
Very, yeah.
Yeah, H2O or something. But there's the bomb that they didn't want to use because, if they were going to use it, it was only to be used once, and that was it. Because, these things are scary, and people were just finding out about new ways to destroy cities, and, it was crazy. So there is some of that here, and that's why I think it's also good they played it pretty straight, and it seems like everyone understands the severity of the situation, and they take it seriously, and it's like, we just have to go get rid of this problem. Like, we have to we have to do what we have to do.
Although I will say I did really like the only kind of real bit of comic relief in the movie was the scientist. Which I actually, some of the jokes didn't necessarily land, but like I love that the character who's supposed to know the most is the one who is the least competent. Because it also
he's like the geek.
he's like the geek, but like he's kind of goofy, and it adds this kind of level of, at least for me, this extra level of fear, where when you start to realize that the person who knows what he's talking about isn't kind of, not sane, that's not the word, but he's kind of a little flighty and all over the place, and then the people who are really serious and not flighty don't know what they're talking about, and it just leaves this really big open space for miscommunication and mistakes. Which obviously just adds to the stakes, because you have these people who don't know what they're dealing with, and they don't speak the same language,
but they have to work together to find
and it really does feel like there was room for someone to make some kind of catastrophic error that
it kind of reminded me, oddly enough, a little bit of Jurassic Park, the way that there's like these different experts in different fields, like coming together and trying to solve, talk about issues and solve problems. And I kind of got a little bit of that. So I really liked the interaction between the scientists and the more military people. And a lot of it was like how people probably viewed scientists at the time, just like those nerds, whatever they're doing. But I thought Edmund Gwenn, who played the older scientist, Dr. Harold Medford, I thought he did a great job with it. Honestly, he does bring a little bit of levity to it, while also like just being a really good character. And he actually played the Santa Claus in Miracle on 34th Street, apparently. So the acting was pretty solid too, all around. Do you think so? Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And I want to mention the writer, because we talked about like the, how terse the film is, and kind of like how like, it's kind of action oriented and beat after beat. And so the writer his name is George Worthing Yates, and he's the one who developed the story. It was actually 2 other writers who wrote the film, but he came up with the idea for the story, and he was a Hollywood veteran by this point, and he had written a lot of serials throughout the years, like The Lone Ranger and things like that. And you can sort of see that kind of tone at play here. It is, like very suspenseful at times, like we talked about, primarily with that climactic sequence in the drain tunnels. through the drainage system when they're crawling through and looking for the ant nests along with the queens. But you can kind of get that feel. Like when I read that about him, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Like, because it kind of has that old, even at that time, at like that older feel to it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And the director, Gordon Douglas, I was looking up him as well. He's pretty prolific, actually. IMDb lists nearly 100 credits,
Wow.
including In Like Flint and a remake of Stagecoach, which I did not know even existed.
Yeah. Which interesting range,
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
interesting,
Nothing like too notable.
Yeah.
In Like Flint has a pretty big following. I've never seen it.
My only association with In Like Flint is in one of the Austin Powers movies.
Yeah,
In Like
that's
Flint
funny.
comes on TV and Austin
I was
says
thinking
that it's
the
his
same
favorite
thing.
movie. So, but this guy Gordon
That's-
Douglas, he directed Austin
yeah.
Powers' favorite movie. So
There you go. So that's something.
Mm-hmm.
And he directed just like a ton of movies. Like I said, around 100. So I guess he was sort of a director for hire, but I think he did a good job here, and I'd be curious to check out his other work as well.
Mhm.
But pretty much that's all I wanted to really talk about. We had mentioned Godzilla a couple times because we just came from that episode, and I wanted to kind of like draw another through line and just kind of talk about these two movies together. We talked about how even though Godzilla is seen as like a B movie, that it has a lot of important and kind of deep things to say, and it comes from a very like emotional and deep place as well. And though this film Them is clearly much more of a straight B movie fare, do you think that there are like similar? We talked about similar messages and things like that. Do you think there's a lot of like similar material to be found in this film as well?
yeah, I do, and I just think that obviously the big difference is that this is a film about the United States, who are
difference, yeah.
the ones who made the bomb and not the ones who suffered by it. So I think that they discuss a lot of the same things. They're attacking a lot of the same subject matter, almost in a pretty directly the same way. It's like there was a bomb test or a bomb, and in Godzilla, it seems more like the bomb awakened a creature. But in this one, you could say that this is an awakening of a creature. It's a mutation, but it kind of was. In both cases, the bomb was the impetus for some natural animalistic horror coming to the surface that was
Like an
attacking
ancient
human
horror.
beings,
Right.
not out of any kind of intellectual reason, but just kind of because
Mhm.
they did.
Instinct.
And both films were about how to deal with it. And
Mhm.
so I think there's a lot of through lines, but I think the difference is that Godzilla felt to me much more like a kind of a parable, more of a warning.
Mhm.
This one felt like a warning, but it also felt like it was supposed to be cool. It felt like it was supposed to be entertaining. Whereas Godzilla, I didn't really get the sense that the filmmakers were as concerned with entertainment as they were with, we talked, if you listen to that episode, but if not, I'll recap. There's one scene in Godzilla where there's like a mother and her children, and the mother is kind of
Just
cowering
thinking
and
about that one. Yeah.
talking about how they're going to go join their father soon. And there's this real sense of like despair, the real tragedy. Whereas with this one, it's kind of more about the thrill of the possibilities, the thrill of the excitement. Even if it's a horrifying excitement, it's not quite as tangible to the American filmmakers, I think, what it actually means, the kind of destruction and what that means. Whereas to the Japanese filmmakers making Godzilla, it hit a lot closer to home, and you could really feel somber tone. Whereas in this one, it felt like it was about 50-50 entertainment to.
Well, yeah, I guess you could. Well, Godzilla is a much more somber movie,
Yeah.
like we talked about, and you can also look at it like it makes sense because they were, the victims at a time when these things were going on, and America was. I see them as more like anxiety, like, oh, this could happen. Like we gotta do something if it does. Like we all gotta band together and take care of it. But with Godzilla, it was more like this happened, and it could happen again. And I think in that way, the movies are pretty different, but you can definitely draw a lot of similarities as well, which I think is why they work well together in the series. And the other movies we're going to talk about, even though they might not seem like they make sense in the series, I think they all have their certain even they're going to get pretty silly, but they all have like an underlying message to them, whether or not that comes across, as well as they wanted it to or not. But yeah, these movies, they're entertaining, but also thought provoking, and does make you think about certain things. And that's what's interesting about them. And I think that's why they've stuck around and resonated for so long. There was one thing I wanted to mention, because you had talked about the studio. It was Universal, you said, right?
Warner Brothers for this one.
I'm sorry. So Warner Brothers, the studio behind them. So they got cold feet like last minute with this film, which is pretty interesting, because we talked about this was the first of the big bug movies. This type of film, I guess. And, this film was originally to have been filmed in color. And 2 days before shooting began, the studio got nervous and they cut the budget. So the film became black and white, which is now how we know it. But however, in the opening credits, you do see that the main title is shown in like a bright red against the black and white background. So it's kind of cool, because it's a little jarring. And I had completely forgotten about that until I watched it again. And, but it's kind of cool, like in a way. It's like one remnants of like this original idea to be in color, and it's kind of effective in its own way. But this is, to me, is like perfect as a black and white sci-fi 50s movie. You know what I mean? It's like it's kind of like the quintessential one that you think of. So for me, it's appropriate that it's black and white.
It's got everything you want. And anything you could possibly want in one of these movies, this movie has it.
It really does. It really does. And it did become sort of the prototype for these kinds of movies that we're going to talk about as well. Not only the big bug features, but also just nuclear monster films and, radiated creatures and things like that. Radiated humans, which we'll get into next time, actually. But did you have any, closing remarks or anything else you wanted to talk about with them?
So there was one really kind of brief scene that stuck with me that I didn't even remember from my previous time watching it that I thought was really interesting. And it was that they were at some type of, like, I don't know if it was an insane asylum or a hospital or something like that, but they were talking to an old man who was clearly supposed to be presented as crazy. And he kept talking about the flying ants, and they understood what he was saying because it was real. But everyone else was looking at him as crazy. And I think, the 1950s and the late 40s were the time in American history when we're are kind of synonymous with like UFO sightings and the mystery of the desert and all of that. And I just think it's really interesting just thinking about from a public perspective, watching a movie like this and seeing that the crazy guy was right. I don't know, that just stuck out to me. It's just really interesting because it was a time when, it was kind of the border between, now it seems like in our current climate, which is 2020 as we record this, it seems like the bigger mysteries and questions. Yeah.
These apocalyptic movies are getting a little too.
Yeah, they're gonna. Yeah. So also just a note, Mark and I were debating whether to bring this up. I guess before we jumped on, but it seems worth noting. This movie also felt a little bit on the button right now as we record this. We're both kind of in the midst of coronavirus isolation, both doing well and feeling healthy, but trying to serve our civic duty by not going out and risking it or spreading it to anyone else. But it was interesting for both of us. We were talking about before we recorded, just seeing how how human beings, particularly America of that time, how they were expected to deal with, crisis and, how it's changed, how it hasn't changed. But yeah, so just an interesting, footnote, I guess.
Well, it's in the back of all our minds right now as we do anything. So obviously watching these, especially these kinds of films, there's something, no matter how silly it is, it's like, okay, giant ants, but maybe it's not that silly. You know what I mean? It's like you kind of draw these like weird conclusions about things now, but an enemy that we can't understand, who all of a sudden has to become the main focus of everything, is this movie might have felt something
different to have watched a few months ago.
Right, something you took for granted before, or just didn't even think about, and so it's like all of a sudden it's become your life. It's like it's like all you think about now, and it's changed everything. So. Yeah, it kind of it's sort of similar. It's weird. These are weird times, Jeremy.
Very weird.
And weird movies.
Hopefully,
but
no
good
giant
movies.
ants show up though. Hopefully,
Yeah.
because
that
I
be-
would, the way this year has been going so far, who
Yeah.
knows? Giant
maybe by
ants.
the end of the year.
Maybe we'll save that for August or
Yeah.
September.
Maybe not tarantula, but maybe we'll get the ants.
Maybe the ants. Yeah.
But actually, you did remind me of something else when you brought up that scene you were talking about, Jeremy. This one scene I wanted to talk about real quick, because it's like it kind of made me like take a moment, because it's a scene we talked about the young girl in the beginning of the film who's kind of wandering around. And there's a scene a little bit later on where she really is catatonic and just sitting there in a chair as they're like talking to her and trying to get something out of her about what she saw.
Mm-hmm.
And she suddenly comes to, like, out of nowhere, and she just starts screaming, them. And, that just kind of gave me chills. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't even remember that scene at all. But like when it happened, I was like, holy shit. Like I didn't even remember they said the title of the film.
Yeah. Well, and it's important to note that utterance of the title is the actual title. Any other time they say them, it's not the title, because the title is them with an exclamation point.
Yeah.
It is not just them, it's them so her screaming them, that is the title of the movie.
Yeah, just over and over screaming them. It was something about it just like gave me the chills. I was like, oh.
Yeah.
It was kind of cool. But yeah, this movie is really cool. And it is fun, entertaining, a little bit thought-provoking. You learn about ants a little bit. And,
Very stylish.
Very stylish, yeah. Very
fun to
really,
watch.
Really well made, well done action. You get flamethrowers, machine guns. You get some on-screen death, I believe, with the ants chomping on people, or with
Yeah,
their
kind of
little,
some on-screen treachery.
yeah.
I don't know about
Yeah,
that, but
for the time, I'm sure it was pretty. Yeah. So me as a fourth grader really appreciated this movie, and I still do. So that's gonna do it for us today with them. This has been Cult Movie Cult. Thank you very much for listening. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult, be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.